Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to provide you with an update on what's happening with the war in Iran, the increasingly fragile ceasefire that was announced earlier this week, and most importantly, what all of this means for the global economy. Because after the initial wave of optimism that swept through the markets on Wednesday, when the announcement of a 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran briefly gave investors hope that the worst might be over, the reality now looks far more complicated and, frankly, far more dangerous. Because while the headlines suggested peace, what we've actually seen over the last 24 hours is a ceasefire that is already under serious strain. But before we get into the details on all of that, if you haven't subscribed yet, could I please ask you to hit that subscribe button? It really does help me with the algorithm and also puts a smile on my face. So let's get into it. When the ceasefire was announced, markets reacted exactly as you would have expected. Oil prices fell sharply, global stock markets rallied, and investors breathed a huge sigh of relief. Thank goodness it's all over, they said. Brent crude dropped back down into the low mid-90s, which was the lowest level we've seen for several weeks, and that led to a strong rebound in risk assets. The reason was simple. The Strait of Hormuz, which is one of the most important shipping routes in the world, around 20% of global oil and gas, flows through that narrow stretch of water every single day, along with huge volumes of petrochemicals and other critical commodities. So when the ceasefire was announced, the market assumed that this meant the reopening of the strait, a normalisation of tanker traffic, and the beginning of a de-escalation process. But the optimism didn't really last very long, because almost immediately after the ceasefire was announced, it became clear that there were major disagreements over what had actually been agreed. And the biggest flashpoint is Lebanon. Israel made it clear very quickly that it did not consider Lebanon to be covered by the ceasefire agreement. And that matters because Hezbollah, which is in Lebanon, is one of Iran's most important regional allies. So while the US and Iran were talking about a pause in direct hostilities, Israel was still continuing its military campaign against Hezbollah. And over the last 24 hours, Israel has carried out some of the most intensive strikes ever in Lebanon. Lebanese officials say that more than 250 people have been killed in the latest wave of attacks and well over 1,000 injured. Israel says that it's targeting Hezbollah military infrastructure. But from Iran's perspective, from Hezbollah's perspective, this completely undermines the spirit of the ceasefire. Iran has been very clear that any credible regional de-escalation must include Lebanon. France has also said publicly that Lebanon must be included in this ceasefire if it's to be meaningful and long-lasting. And this is why the ceasefire already looks very fragile. Because instead of seeing a calm reduction in tensions, we've seen Hezbollah retaliate with missile fire into northern Israel, while Iran has accused both Israel and the USA of violating the terms of the agreement. So this is not peace, this is a pause, and at the moment a very shaky pause. Now, one of the biggest sticking points in the talks, and one of the reasons why the ceasefire remains so fragile, is Iran's nuclear program. Iran has consistently maintained that it has the sovereign right to enrich uranium for peaceful civilian purposes. It says enrichment is necessary to fuel its nuclear power stations, support electricity generation, and provide material for medical and industrial uses. And under international treaties, countries are allowed to pursue civilian nuclear programs. However, the concern from the United States and Israel is that the same enrichment technology that can be used for civilian purposes can also, if taken further, be used to create weapons-grade material. That's why this issue remains absolutely central to the talks. Iran denies that it wants to create a nuclear weapon, but Washington and Tel Aviv clearly do not trust Tehran's intentions. In fact, one of the key US demands ahead of this weekend's talks is understood to be that Iran hands over or gives up control of its existing stockpiles of enriched uranium. So even though there is talk of diplomacy, one of the biggest strategic issues that caused this conflict in the first place remains unresolved. And that takes us to the diplomatic efforts. The United States and Iran are due to hold direct talks in Islamabad in Pakistan this weekend. JD Vance is expected to lead the US delegation. Donald Trump has also made it very clear that US military presence in the region will remain in place throughout the process. And Trump has warned that if Iran fails to engage seriously in these talks, then the USA is prepared for what he described as a much bigger military escalation. So the stakes here could not be higher, because if these talks fail, then there is a very real risk that we move straight back into a much more dangerous phase of this conflict. Now let's talk about the global economy, because this is the part that I don't think the markets are properly pricing in. Yes, the stock markets rallied on the ceasefire news, not surprisingly. Yes, oil prices came down from their peak. But even if this ceasefire somehow holds, and even if we see no further major escalation from here, the global economy has already suffered serious damage. And that damage is going to feed through over the next few months, because the spike in energy prices has already happened. Even after the pullback, Brent crude is still sitting in the mid to high 90s right now. That is dramatically higher than where it was at the start of 2026, when it was trading at around $60. So although markets celebrated the fall in oil prices, the reality is that energy costs remain at levels that will cause meaningful economic pain, because higher oil prices don't just affect motorists, they feed through into almost every single part of the global economy. Transport firms pay more for diesel, airlines pay more for jet fuel, manufacturers pay more for electricity and industrial power, chemical companies face higher feedstock costs, farmers face higher fertilizer costs, food producers face higher logistics and packaging costs, and ultimately all of those extra costs get passed on to you. So what we're likely to see over the next few months is a delayed inflationary effect. Lots of companies have not yet reported the financial impact because we're still in the early stages of this conflict. But make no mistake, the cost shock is already in the system, it's fully baked in. And this is where I think there is a genuine disconnect between the markets and the underlying economic reality, because stock markets are now back close to where they were before this latest ceasefire announcement. And frankly, that doesn't make any sense, because the damage has already been done. We're also seeing significant disruption to physical infrastructure in the Middle East. Oil and gas facilities have been damaged by missiles and drones. Export routes have been disrupted, and there have been knock-on effects for global supplies of critical materials. That includes liquefied natural gas, petrochemicals, aluminium-related inputs, fertilizer such as ammonium nitrates, and industrial gases like helium. We've talked about all of these in previous videos. These are not niche products, they are essential inputs into global manufacturing, agriculture, food production, electronics, and transport. So even if the shooting and bombing stop tomorrow, the supply shock does not simply disappear overnight. It will take time to repair the infrastructure, it will take time to clear the shipping backlogs, and it takes time to restore confidence. And at the moment, that confidence simply isn't there. The Strait of Hormuz is the clearest example of that. Although the ceasefire is supposed to pave the way for a reopening, traffic through Hormuz remains highly restricted. Iran still appears to be exercising significant control over which ships are allowed through. There are reports that vessels linked to countries seen as neutral or friendly towards Iran are being allowed passage more easily, while Western-linked vessels are still facing uncertainty, delays, and very high insurance costs. So this is not a return to normal, this is a controlled bottleneck, and the consequences of that are huge. Higher shipping costs, longer transit delays, disrupted supply chains, higher insurance premiums, and more inflationary pressure feeding into the global economy. So from an economic perspective, even the best case scenario from here still involves a meaningful hit to global growth in 2026. And if this ceasefire does collapse, then frankly, things will get significantly worse, because we're not just talking about a regional military conflict in the Middle East that doesn't impact on anybody. We're talking about one of the world's most important energy choke points, one of the most sensitive geopolitical flashpoints on the planet, and a global economy that was already fragile before all of this began. So where does all of this leave us? Well, the honest answer is this. The ceasefire has bought the world some time. That's it. It's not solved the underlying problems. Lebanon remains a major flashpoint. Iran's nuclear program remains unresolved. The Strait of Hormuz remains uncertain, and the global economy is already carrying the scars of the last few weeks. So yes, there is still a chance that the talks in Islamabad could stabilise the situation, but the risks remain very high, and I think the market relief rally may prove to be premature. So I'll keep you posted on any further news and developments as and when they occur. Hopefully you found today's video useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking, trying to provoke some thoughts. If you've liked what I've said, or maybe you didn't like it, but you thought it was interesting, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. It's another way of helping to fund the channel and a bit of fun at the same time. If you'd like to get involved in that, then please scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below. I've got some really exciting deals on the go at the moment. It's a good time to get involved. Thank you also to everyone that's supporting me in other ways. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you for that support. It really does help to keep me focused and making as many videos as I can. And finally, as many of you already know, I've recently launched a new channel with my friend Naz. It's called Joe and Naz, keeping it simple, and it's all about food, fun, and banter. Now, we're just getting started, and we'd really appreciate your support. If you could click the link at the end of today's video, it will take you straight through to one of the best restaurants in the world that we visited recently, although I should warn you that the visit didn't quite go to plan. It wasn't quite what we were expecting, but it should definitely be interesting and put a smile on your face. And here's something else that will also put a smile on your face.